How did Mercedes exploit Article C5.4.3 to run an effective compression ratio approaching 18,001 at operating temperature while staying perfectly legal under the 16.0 ambient limit? And why are Honda, Ferrari, and Audi still furious even after the FIA privately cleared the engine? That specific technical contradiction is exactly what I researched regarding the Mercedes engine loophole, and understanding it explains why rivals remain angry despite a unanimous mid-season rule change. The tension here is not just about whether Brackley found a clever interpretation of the 2026 power unit regulations, but about a far more uncomfortable reality that emerged when the governing body conducted secret compression checks at hot running temperatures and told Mercedes their design was compliant. You would assume that finding would end the argument immediately, yet the paddock reaction suggests something else entirely is driving the ongoing hostility. So where does that leave us with the actual performance delta? Rival manufacturers have circulated estimates suggesting this thermal expansion strategy could be worth anywhere from 10 to 13 horsepower, or potentially even larger under specific conditions. But here is the twist that complicates the entire narrative. Those numbers are not confirmed FIA findings. They are rival estimates born from frustration and simulation data, meaning we still do not have an official, quantified performance benefit attached to this controversy, despite the intense political pressure that forced a regulatory rewrite. This distinction matters because it separates proven fact from paddock paranoia, and it forces us to ask whether the anger is truly about lost tenths per lap or about a deeper sense of procedural unfairness that no amount of future testing can retroactively fix. Engine materials expand, heat changes geometry, rules stayed static. This physical reality is what allowed the dispute to exist in the first place, as the original regulation only mandated measurement at ambient temperature, leaving a massive gray area for engineers who understood metallurgy better than the rulebook writers did. The 2026 power unit formula introduced a significantly larger electrical component than previous generations, giving every manufacturer a fresh design slate and far less precedent for how these measurements should be enforced in practice. When you combine brand new architecture with a measurement protocol that ignored thermal dynamics, you create an environment where intelligent engineering looks suspiciously like cheating to those who took a more conservative approach. Shintaro Orihara from Honda noted that when they started running in Barcelona, they realized their performance was definitely poor compared to other manufacturers, and while that statement addressed Honda's own separate deficit, it underscores the atmosphere of suspicion that permeated the early season. But if the FIA already validated the Mercedes concept through undisclosed testing, why did all 5 power unit manufacturers still approve a new measurement regime via e-vote? The answer lies in a compromise that satisfied nobody completely, but prevented the championship from collapsing into litigation. From June 1, 2026 onward, compression ratios must be measured in both cold and 130 degrees Celsius hot conditions, with the transition to hot-only measurement arriving in 2027. This forward-looking fix preserved every single point Mercedes had scored, creating a scenario where the alleged advantage remains embedded in the championship standings even as the loophole itself has been closed. That unresolved gap between private legality and public perception is precisely what keeps this story alive long after the technical directive was issued. The mechanism behind this controversy relies entirely on the difference between a static measurement and a dynamic reality, specifically how Article C5.4.3 defined compliance solely at ambient temperature without accounting for the extreme thermal loads of a 2026 power unit. Engineers at Brackley reportedly selected internal engine materials engineered to expand significantly under heat, creating a geometric shift that only manifests once the metal reaches operating temperature. Cold, the cylinder dimensions satisfy the 16.0 maximum ratio written in the regulations. Hot, the same components allegedly reshape themselves to approach an 18,001 effective ratio, extracting combustion efficiency that simply does not exist during the scrutineering process. This is not a software map or a fuel flow trick. It is fundamental thermodynamics applied to regulatory silence. Metals shift silently, geometry changes invisibly, scrutineers see nothing. The brilliance of this approach, if the rival allegations hold true, is that it exploits a blind spot in the enforcement methodology rather than breaking a written prohibition. Motor Biscuit framed this phenomenon as the 130-degree loophole, characterizing it as clever engineering that sits uncomfortably close to the line without technically crossing it. But can you really blame competitors for feeling cheated when the rulebook measures one thing and the racetrack rewards another? When your own engine passes every cold test with perfect compliance yet still loses straight-line speed to a car whose geometry transforms after the garage doors close, the distinction between legal and fair begins to dissolve. This emotional friction is what transformed a technical query into a full-blown political crisis involving 3 major manufacturers demanding answers. Honda, Ferrari, and Audi did not merely whisper about this in the motorhome, they formally challenged the design, forcing the FIA into an unprecedented position of having to validate or condemn a concept that existed in a regulatory gray zone. The governing body responded by conducting undisclosed compression checks on the Mercedes engine at hot operating temperatures, a secretive testing protocol prompted directly by manufacturer pressure. What makes this moment so critical to understanding the current anger is the outcome of those secret tests. The FIA privately informed Mercedes that the engine was legal under the regulations as they stood at the time of testing. There was no infringement notice. There was no disqualification, just a quiet confirmation that the expansion strategy complied with the letter of Article C5.4.3. That private clearance should have settled the matter definitively, yet it arguably poured gasoline on the fire instead of extinguishing it. So where does that leave us regarding the actual scale of the advantage? Estimates circulating through the paddock suggest the performance gain could be roughly 10 to 13 horsepower, with some reports indicating the benefit might be even larger under specific high-load conditions. But here is the crucial narrative twist that prevents this from being a simple case of proven cheating. Those horsepower figures are not FIA-confirmed data points. They are rival estimates derived from simulation gaps and telemetry analysis, meaning the exact magnitude of the advantage remains officially unquantified even as the rulebook has been rewritten to prevent its future use. We know the concept worked well enough to trigger a unanimous regulatory change, but we cannot state with certainty exactly how many tenths per lap it was worth. This uncertainty creates a permanent ambiguity that fuels continued resentment among teams who feel they lost ground to a ghost. GP fans published analysis explicitly attempting to disprove the compression allegations, arguing that evidence exists which contradicts the loophole narrative entirely. This media split proves that even specialist observers cannot agree on what actually happened inside those cylinders, leaving the paddock divided between those who believe Mercedes found a genius solution and those who think the entire controversy is overblown speculation. Yet regardless of which side of that editorial divide you fall on, the tangible result was a mid-season rule change approved unanimously via e-vote by all 5 power unit manufacturers. From June 1, 2026, onward, compression ratios must be verified in both cold and 130 degrees Celsius conditions, effectively closing the thermal window that made this debate possible in the first place. The formal complaints from Honda, Ferrari, and Audi were not casual paddock grievances, but calculated regulatory challenges that forced the FIA into an unprecedented enforcement position. These 3 manufacturers did not simply ask for clarification, they demanded physical verification of a concept they believed violated the spirit of Article C5.4.3, even if it technically satisfied the ambient measurement protocol. The governing body responded by conducting secret compression checks on the Mercedes power unit at operating temperature, a testing methodology that had never been part of the standard scrutineering process because the regulations had never previously required it. This clandestine evaluation was prompted entirely by manufacturer pressure, creating a scenario where the enforcer had to invent new procedures mid-season to address a design that existed in a legislative blind spot. Tests ran quietly, results stayed private, tension mounted publicly. What emerged from those undisclosed sessions was a finding that simultaneously validated Mercedes' engineering and infuriated their competitors. The FIA privately communicated to the team that the engine was legal under the regulations as they stood at the time of testing. There was no infringement notice issued, no points were deducted, no championship positions were adjusted. The governing body essentially confirmed that the thermal expansion strategy complied with the written rules, even as the political fallout from that confirmation threatened to destabilize the competitive balance of the entire 2026 season. This private clearance is the exact moment when technical compliance and competitive fairness diverged permanently. But why would rivals remain angry if the highest authority in the sport had already rendered a verdict in Mercedes' favor? The answer lies in the distinction between legality and legitimacy, a gap that no official statement can bridge when teams feel the rulebook failed to anticipate the very innovation it was supposed to govern. Shintaro Orihara from Honda stated that when they started running in Barcelona, they realized their performance was definitely poor compared to other manufacturers, and while that quote specifically addressed Honda's own separate power deficit rather than the Mercedes controversy directly, it captures the broader atmosphere of suspicion that defined the early season. When you are losing tenths every weekend and believe the cause is a regulatory oversight rather than genuine engineering superiority, a private legality finding feels less like justice and more like institutional failure. So where does that leave us regarding the path forward from that secret verdict? The FIA recognized that private reassurance would not restore competitive trust, which is why they pursued a compromise solution despite having already cleared the design. The official FIA statement released by ESPN confirmed that a significant effort had been invested in finding a solution to the topic of the compression ratio, language that acknowledges the complexity without admitting any regulatory error. This careful phrasing reflects a governing body trying to maintain authority while correcting a measurement gap that had already been exploited. The resulting unanimous e-vote approval from all 5 power unit manufacturers demonstrates that everyone understood the alternative was continued litigation and eroded confidence in the championship itself. Remember how this all started. with the specific claim that Mercedes allegedly achieved an effective compression ratio approaching 18,001 at operating temperature despite the 16.0 ambient limit in Article C5. That opening technical contradiction is precisely what the secret hot temperature checks were designed to investigate, and the fact that those checks returned a legal verdict is exactly why the anger persists. Rivals are not mad because Mercedes broke the rules. They are mad because Mercedes followed rules that turned out to be incomplete, and the subsequent fix arrives too late to recover whatever performance Delta had already been banked during the first half of the season. The private clearance resolved the regulatory question but left the competitive grievance completely untouched, embedding the controversy into the championship standings themselves. The resolution to this dispute arrived not through punishment, but through a unanimous e-vote that fundamentally altered how compression ratios are measured for the remainder of the 2026 season and beyond. All 5 power unit manufacturers approved the change, which mandates that compression be verified in both cold and 130 degrees Celsius hot conditions starting June 1, 2026, before transitioning to hot-only measurement from 2027 onward. This forward-looking regulatory fix closed the thermal loophole without revisiting any results already posted, meaning Mercedes retained every point scored during the period when the alleged advantage was most potent. No championship standings were adjusted. No race wins were rescinded. The compromise satisfied the technical concern while deliberately avoiding the competitive chaos of retroactive enforcement. Rules changed instantly, past stayed intact, future locked down. This approach reflects a governing body prioritizing championship stability over historical correction, a choice that makes practical sense even as it leaves rivals questioning whether justice was truly served.